Welcome to Mormon Book Reviews, where an evangelical encounters the restoration. I'm your host, Steven Pynakker, and I can't believe it's been over 3 years since I first had my guest, Matt Harris, on, who is a great friend. He actually was the one that came up with the idea for the presentation at last year's John Whitmer Historical Association in Texas, where he approached Rick Bennett and I about presenting about podcasting Mormon history, which then led to me giving a presentation at June's Mormon History Association as well. Unfortunately, I couldn't do that one I had to do that from remotely because of my medical condition, which I am getting better, by the way, folks. But Matt Harris has been a really good friend. I originally had him on to talk about the book that he wrote, Thunder from the Right. And this is a fantastic book, and we'll have links in the description for those of you who'd like to purchase it. But today we're going to talk about Second Class Saints, the new book, the best-selling book. First printing was sold out. They do have them, Amazon stocked with these babies, so you can order them. Matt Harris, welcome back to the program. How are you doing today?
Hey, I'm doing great, Steve. Thanks for having me back. It's really good to see you again.
Yes, it is. It's always a pleasure. I really, are you going to be going to Whitmer this year by chance?
Yeah, I'll be there. I'm participating in two panels, one on post-manifesto polygamy, and one we're critiquing a brand new book out called American Zion by Mormon scholar Ben Park.
Awesome. That's great. That's right. I read that. I heard that would be great. I love it. I wish I could. I don't think I'm going to be able to make it this year just because of everything, but maybe, I don't know. It's if maybe the Lord will open a door for me and I'll end up doing it. I don't know. But I wish you well. I really love Whitmer, and it sounds to me like they're going to have a pretty packed house. It looks to me like a lot of people in Utah who normally have never been to the conference. This is the first Whitmer Association happening in Utah ever. So it seems like they've got a ton of papers that are going to be presented, a lot of great panels. Seems like it's going to be a really interesting conference, Matt. I imagine you're excited about just going, even just to sit in on some of those presentations.
Yeah, there's I'm part of the Whitmer leadership. I didn't play on this program, I might add. I wasn't on the planning committee, but I did hear that they had more presentation proposals than they've ever had in a very long time. So anyway, that's a good thing, right? It's increasing awareness about restoration history and how important it is.
That's great. Yep. So we love you over at Whitmer. We love you at Mormon History Association. We think it's great that these organizations are doing the work that they're doing. And of course, I really appreciate the work that you're doing, Matt. I mean, this was really a ground book. This is your magus opus, if you will. You've been working on this for how long would you say, in one sense, you've been working on this book?
15 years. I mean, not continuously. I did other books in between, including the one you just showcased a minute ago. But I've been working on this for 15 years and I'd been building up this research file. I got access to a lot of restricted collections. And then finally, I just realized, I got to write this. I have enough material. Let's start writing. So it took me probably 15 years to write and research. The writing would have been pretty intense the last year and a half of the project.
And I'm just curious for those of you who in the publishing world and authors world, when you first started this book, like how does this work for you to shop this around? Did Oxford go to you and say they want you to write this, or did you have to shop this around to different publishers? But just what does that look like?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked this. It's publishing a book is a really interesting thing. I uh, I did a book with Oxford years ago, and I Oxford's an academic press. It's one of the best academic presses in the world. And the difference between an academic press and what's called a commercial press is an academic press goes through a very rigorous peer review process where they send the manuscript out to scholars where they can critique the manuscript and they can give their thumbs up to publish it or thumbs down. And so Oxford was the top academic press because I'd already published with them before. I had a good experience. And of course, as I said, they're one of the best university presses in the world. But initially, I wanted to shop this to a commercial press, and they're not peer reviewed, which doesn't mean a whole lot for me because I have friends that would give me a good review of the manuscript. So that's not an issue for me. But the peer review or the commercial press option is they have a better marketing arm typically, and they have a quicker turnaround time. An academic press takes about a year from the time you submit the final manuscript to the time it's published. And so a commercial press, you have to have an agent, a literary agent. And so they won't even look at an unsolicited manuscript. And academic presses have both. They have literary agents and they have just unsolicited manuscript proposals. So for me, I looked at the commercial press option, and they, I think the person who first looked at it, he liked it, but it was the manuscript was too big. They want to keep their price points at a certain range, and my manuscript was probably well over 600 pages, and it was really detailed. And he told me, he said, you'd have to cut some of the detail out for us to publish it. And I said, no, thanks. Because the beauty of this book is the detail, the level of nuance, and the source material. And I just was unwilling to cut that. And I knew that I could negotiate with Oxford an acceptable length that would please me and please them. Whereas the commercial people, they were less flexible. And so in the end, I opted not to go with them.
Okay, great. And then I just wanted to just talk a little bit more about, and before we actually delve into the book, I just want to ask you kind of like, what's it like to have this? I know you've been publishing, you've been an author for a long time, so maybe we can speak generally. But really, this was a passion project of yours for a very long time. And for to see how well it's been received, you've been doing the circuit, you've been on Mormon Stories, you've been on Gospel Tangents, you've been on all, all the ones that you would expect to be on. You would have been here a few months ago if I didn't have my issues. But what's it been like to do the circuit and then sell a bunch of copies? I mean, the first printing sold out like almost immediately. What was that like for you as an author? That must have been so exciting.
Yeah, man, Steve, I've never been asked these questions before. You're forcing me to reflect, and I really appreciate it. So I knew the book would be a big hit because this something of this kind has never been done in Mormon studies. We have some really, really good books on Mormons and race and the ban and all of that in the 19th century, but nothing in the 20th and 21st centuries, which is the focus of my book. And also, no scholars have ever been given access to all the material that I've gotten access to. So I knew there was a story there, and I know Latter-day Saints and how they learn and what they learn from the church. I knew there'd be high interest in this book from church members and scholars. What I didn't know is that there'd be a huge interest outside of Mormon studies. And so for my book to go out of print almost immediately, that means that people not of the faith were also purchasing it. I've done interviews with National Public Radio. I've done interviews with a lot of non-LDS forums that reach audiences that are typically not Latter-day Saints. And so that was shocking to me, Steve, and also very gratifying because I'm reaching a story that transcends Mormonism.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a great way to look at it. And it is interesting how people, this is kind of like the Mormon moment in the sense that there's a lot of outside interest in Mormonism. And it's so funny, it was 2 years. One of the reasons John Dehlin had me a couple of years ago on Mormon Stories was because he did a poll and realized that the majority of his audience were never Mos who were just interested in the subject. And so he's like, we got to get you down here, Steve, because you're going to address that, you're part of that audience. And so it is fascinating to see the interest that's there. And I guess, for you, I mean, you this is your background and everything like that. As somebody who is, I mean, I guess the question I have for you, and I want to get into the book, but what was it that got you interested in the subject in the first place?
Well, a couple things. So, I went to BYU. I grew up a Latter-day Saint. I served a mission. And in the Mormon community, when you serve a mission as a 19-year-old young man, this is the first time where, you're confronted with questions about your faith. And I think that my experience in the church growing up in Maine, I grew up in Maine, and it was probably similar to most people who lived outside of the Mormon corridor, as we call it, Utah, Idaho, Arizona, where there are large concentrations of Mormons. And when there are large concentrations of Mormons in those three states, that means they get release time from high school. So let's say there's a study hall at their high school, and the church would put a seminary building across the street to make it convenient for people to just walk across the street and go to seminary as part of their study hall. So it's worked into their school day curriculum Well, in Maine, they wouldn't do that because it's just really me and my two sisters and a few other people. So we had what's called early morning seminary, and which is not atypical for people outside of the Mormon corridor. They have early morning seminary for Latter-day Saint youth across the world, actually. Anyway, but my knowledge of church things was limited. I mean, the teacher, you're trying to teach sleepy-eyed, 16-year-olds theology at 5:30 in the morning. I mean, give me a break, right? We're already sleep deprived. But they did the best they could. They would bring donuts and, but I didn't know anything about the race story. And when I got on my mission, I remember coming across some investigators, some folks who were African American, and one man in particular in Pocatello, where I was serving. I served in Idaho as my mission. And one of my areas was Pocatello. And I remember meeting this Black man, and he asked about the priesthood ban. This would have been late 80s. The ban had been gone for 10 years at that point, 11 years. But I didn't know what to say. I gave him an answer. Well, we don't know why. I mean, what a dumb answer, right? The church has answers to some of life's most pressing questions. But when it comes to something as fundamental as denying the salvific ordinances for millions of people, the best you got is, we don't know why. And that never sat well with me. And so I did some research. And I started digging into some of the literature written by church leaders. And that really made it even worse, Steve, because then I start reading about a biblical curse that Black people, allegedly did something wrong in a pre-earth life. They were fence sitters, all of that stuff. And that made it even worse because I thought this just doesn't, it doesn't feel right. And I was a young man teaching theology, and I always felt like that our church had good theology, that theology that united people and created harmony in people's lives. And this is a classic instance of the church not creating good theology. This is a theology that divided people. And so that's the short answer to how I got involved in this is my mission experience. And then when I got older and became a professional historian, the first part of my career was in early American history. My first book I did with Oxford University Press deals with the founding fathers and religion. And I did a couple of 3 books in early America. And then about 15, I don't know, 16, 17 years ago, I transitioned to Mormon studies, in particular in American religion and race in general. And when I transitioned to Mormon studies, I realized that the first thing I wanted to research and explore was this whole ban, the context, the theology, the history. I got interested in civil rights. What did the church think about civil rights? And so that's what put me in touch with this. And I'm really glad I did this book because it's just such an important topic for where we're at today in the world.
So I want to read in the preface here a paragraph that I think kind of summarizes things and really stuck out for me when I was reading the book. The policy was colloquially known as the priesthood ban, but it was far-reaching than that. It meant that Black Latter-day Saints couldn't hold the priesthood, solemnize their wedding vows in Mormon temples, marry someone of another race, sermonize in worship service, bestow priesthood blessings on their children, give Sunday school lessons, offer pastoral counsel, count church tithes, or serve church missions. They were the only racial minorities designated for these exclusions, and not surprisingly, their pain has been acute and long-lasting. Black Latter-day Saint Melody Jackson, still bearing the trauma of that ban, reflected, quote, the church refused to grant the Black body whole recognition and divinity. To Nephi, I was not fair and delightsome. To Joseph, I was a violator of the most sacred principles of society, chastity, and virtue. To Brigham, I was Cain's curse. To McConkie, I was an unfaithful spirit, a fence sitter. Maybe
That's
speak to that.
powerful.
Yeah, it's a very powerful paragraph.
Yeah, I've never met this young woman, but as I understand it, she's a young Black Mormon woman who wrote this in Dialogue, which is one of the most important journals in Mormon studies. And I remember when I read this, I thought, wow, I circled her quote and how she felt. And that really grabbed me. And one of the things I wanted to do in this book that was really, really important was to capture the voices of Black Latter-day Saints and also Black people in general, because this is really, it's hard to write a book about Black Latter-day Saints and not immerse yourself in the voices of Black Latter-day Saints. Let me say another thing about the ban. For years, it was just simply called a priesthood ban, that people of African descent could not hold the priesthood. But in, I don't know, 10, 12, 13 years ago, a scholar, a friend of mine made a point and said, it's more than just a priesthood ban, it's also a temple ban. And that's mostly true because Black people could enjoy limited temple rituals, but they couldn't experience the full rituals of marriage, which are called sealings, or other important rituals in the temple. So it really is a priesthood and temple ban. And then as I got to thinking about it, writing this book, it was also a ban from participation, from speaking in church, giving a church lesson, none of which has anything to do with the priesthood. It was just really driven by racism. And so when I thought about all the things that Black people, Black Latter-day Saints were denied in the church, it really transcended more than just the priesthood.
Mm. Yeah, and I think that's important. That was what really struck me was just how absolutely segregated they really were from the church. And I want to kind of talk about the early days here. And of course, I wrote most of my notes were based on early church history because that's really that's my sweet spot, if you will, And I wanted to talk a little bit about um some of the early saints. Now, I have to tell you, this was a revelation to me. I did not know that Black Pete had a name. It's Pete Kerr. And I just wanted to ask you that because the last time I delved in this subject and with the research I was looking at, it was a name that wasn't known. Maybe it's just a blind spot on my part, but how do we know? How were you able to or identify Pete Kerr as being Black Pete? And again, that's just so you understand, folks. This is early days, Kirtland, Ohio, 1831. There's Pentecostal things happening. There's speaking in tongues. There's exorcisms going on. Black Pete is a part of this whole movement. He's a really important person. Early days. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so Latter-day Saints engaged in a number of practices that would be very familiar to some of your evangelical listeners in terms of speaking in tongues and all of that. And this shouldn't be a surprise to people because many of the earliest converts to the Latter-day Saint movement came from evangelical and Protestant Christian backgrounds. So that's not really hard to wrap your mind around. And Latter-day Saints, there's a handful of Black men who were ordained to the priesthood in the early days of the church under Mormon founder Joseph Smith Jr. And that drastically changed with Smith's successor, Brigham Young, in 1852. But among the earliest priesthood holders, we have conclusive evidence for a handful that we have good evidence that they held the priesthood. They served in priesthood functions, priesthood callings, ecclesiastical positions of authority. Black Pete or Peter Kerr is one that we're not entirely sure about. And there was an archivist at the Church History Library in Salt Lake, to answer your question, Steve, who came across some records and identified Black Pete as Peter Kerr.
Oh,
So if you go on the LDS Church website today, that's where I first saw it.
hmm.
You'll see his name, Black Pete, in quotes, because that's how he was known to the Latter-day Saints in the 19th century. But this Latter-day Saint scholar on the website identifies his real name. And so I only use Black Pete because that's how he's known to most people. And I
Right.
put, Peter Carr in parentheses, but
That's great.
it's
Yeah, it's
it's good
great.
to know their name.
It is. I think it's honoring. So I'm glad that you were able to pull that up. And I think Mark Staker is one that thinks that Pete Kerr did get the priesthood. So I think that's an early candidate. I want you to talk about some of the early Elijah Abel. I also want you to talk about Jane Manning James as well as people early days, new Joseph, and certainly he seemed to take a different approach than what would later happen in the church.
Yeah, so Joseph Smith, he certainly had racial views common to people in his generation. For example, he referred to Black people as the sons of Cain in his private writings. That's not uncommon. Protestants and Catholics and Jews and Muslims have been talking about that Black people derive from this biblical curse. And Mormons accept this theology uncritically. And Joseph Smith, the Mormon prophet, will as well. The differences between Smith and his successors is that Smith allows priesthood ordination, and he didn't personally ordain Elijah Abel, an early Black priesthood holder, but he allowed it to happen under his leadership. And Joseph Smith was also sensitive to the needs of a Black woman named Jane Manning James. She grew up in Connecticut, came across some Mormon missionaries, and then with her family, her mother and I think some of her siblings, they made this long and arduous trek from Connecticut to Nauvoo, Illinois, which at that point in the early 1840s was the hub of church headquarters. And Jane Manning James was taken in by the saints speaking in tongues, their miraculous healing practices, and the fact that the church did not segregate by race. And a lot of churches in the 19th century had segregationist policies, something that would be codified into law after the American Civil War. But before the American Civil War, a lot of churches just had segregated pews for a variety of reasons, not least of which is interracial intimacy. They want to keep black and white people apart because they're afraid of violating, interracial marriage customs. So anyway, Jane Manning James made the trek, became enchanted with this new Mormon religion. She became enchanted with the prophet who's performing some of these miraculous healings and speaking in tongues. And Joseph Smith takes her in as his servant. So this black woman, Jane Manning James, lives in the home of Joseph Smith in Nauvoo. And she's doing his laundry. She's laundering his special, the Mormons call it the garment, the special garment that one would receive as they approach temple worship. It's just this protective clothing that Latter-day Saints believe in. So she's laundering his garment, this sacred religious artifact. And she also is shown by Smith the Urim and Thummim, the special instrument that Smith uses to translate the Book of Mormon. So Jane Manning James is a significant character because she's really up close and personal to the founding prophet. And later on, Steve, after the prophet's murdered in 1844, she'll petition a slew of church presidents to receive her temple ordinances and to be married or sealed to her husband in the temple. And they turn her down because she's black. By this point, there's a ban in place for both the temple and the priesthood. And she begs one of the church presidents, she said, "Let me be sealed to the prophet Joseph Smith." And I want to just stop for a moment and share something that I talked to a scholar, recently about this sealing and, maybe as a polygamous wife. And I said, no, no, no. There's not going to be a sealing to a polygamous wife. That would be scandalous in the 19th century. There's no way that this black woman's applying to be sealed as a polygamous wife. There's no evidence for that. But beyond that, it would be absolutely scandalous knowing what we know about interracial marriage in the 19th century. But more likely, she was asking to be sealed as a member of his family because Smith taught this theology that the human family had to be connected or aligned to each other. And you could make those alignments through temple worship. And that's what she was asking to do when she wanted to be sealed to the prophet. She was asking to be sealed as a member of his family, not his polygamous wife. At least that's my view. And I'm sticking by
it. Good. Okay. And I did want to mention, because I think it's important, that a lot of people want to put a lot of the racism on the church. And of course, there is certainly that. But you did allude to it. And you talked about how, this was part of 19th century Protestant Christianity, the Curse of Cain. A lot of your Southern churches were advocating these positions very staunchly. So there was this racial stuff that existed for a very long time before the restoration even began. So I think it's really important that we lay the groundwork that there was this kind of insistence of this racist stuff that was going on, even racist views in general, but also they were codified almost into Christian theology in a similar way. But I want to talk about specifically the scriptures of the restoration, being the Book of Mormon and the Pearl of Great Price, as well as being two documents that kind of, if you will, codify some of these teachings. Maybe speak to that.
Yeah, so Latter-day Saints will derive the curse of Cain and the curse of Ham and the curse of Canaan. It's usually those three figures that are used interchangeably, and those derive from Genesis in the Old Testament. And when Joseph Smith, the prophet, was making a translation he revisits the Bible and he creates his own translation because he thinks that the King James Bible the one that Latter-day Saints use and still use today, that he thinks that it's got some errors. And so he starts to look at the Bible in a different lens. And out of that comes a new book of scripture called the Book of Moses that will comprise part of the Pearl of Great Price, which there are 4 books in the Mormon canon. There's the Bible, the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, and the Pearl of Great Price. And the Book of Moses derives from Smith's efforts to translate the Bible, to look at it through a new lens. And in that translation, you see, or that inspiration, I think it kind of changes how the church has talked about it over the years. But in that book of scripture that Smith produced, it does talk about race. And it said that God had segregated the seed of Adam from the seed of Cain. And 20th century Mormon leaders will look at that critical verse of scripture to create a proof text for segregation in the 20th century. And so the book of Moses is far more explicit in its treatment of race and segregation than the Old Testament is. And then the other half of the Pearl of Great Price is what's called the Book of Abraham. And the Book of Abraham, there were some Egyptian scrolls that Smith came across in 1834 and 1835. And Smith, for a long time, the church said that Smith had translated those scrolls, and the result would be the Book of Abraham today, which comprises part of the Pearl of Great Price. In recent years, the church has backed off that claim and argued that it was inspiration rather than translation. But the Book of Abraham is the biggest proof text for the priesthood and temple ban, because in the early chapters of the Book of Abraham, it talks about a premortal existence. And that's a fancy word that says that everybody before they were born, no matter where they were born in the world, no matter the time or the place, they all lived in this premortal existence as spirit beings. And they witnessed this plan between Jehovah and also Satan. And they're trying to appeal to Elohim, the Father. And Jesus presented a plan, and Satan presented a plan. And Mormon theology, they look at the early chapters of Abraham, and they argue that Black people were cursed because they chose the wrong plan. They chose Satan's plan. That's one version of it. There's another version where they couldn't make up their minds and they sort of straddled the fence. But so Mormons will tie the ban and race into this premortal existence. And that becomes, Steve, really, really popular in Mormon corners after the American Civil War. That becomes canonized into church doctrine. And I might add for your listeners, the premortal existent theology that the Latter-day Saints create in the late 19th and into the early 20th century, that's what makes Mormon racial teachings wholly unique from evangelicals and Catholics and Protestants who merely talk about a divine curse from the Bible. But Mormons are now going to take it a step further and tie that divine curse into a premortal existence. And those ideas have a tremendous staying power in Mormon culture well into the 21st century.
And I also think it's important that we speak really with the founding document of the Restoration, which is the Book of Mormon, talking about a curse of skin of darkness as well. Maybe address that as well.
Yeah, I've talked about this a lot in my book and in talks I've given. The Book of Mormon does not talk about Black people or people of African descent. When it talks about, it's full of racialized verses. It talks about, like you said, skins of blackness, and it talks about a curse that we would say brown people today, or indigenous people. The Book of Mormon
Okay, yeah.
identifies them as Lamanites.
Let me ask you that, because I find it fascinating, and people have brought this up to me, and I want to toss this at this thought at you. Is at the time, Native Americans were referred to as red. That's where we get the name of the team that played in football, that kind. They were commonly referred to as red, and implying that why would that term not have been used in the Book of Mormon as opposed to a skin of darkness? What are your thoughts on that? Like why wouldn't the translator use the term, like the idea is if it was referring to the Native American Indians, why not use the common term that they would have referred to them at that time?
Well, of course, it bears the reflections of the language of Smith's time. And Smith argued that it wasn't just Native Americans that the Lamanite term applies to. That's the term the Book of Mormon uses, Lamanite. The Lamanite is a designation that's very all-encompassing. So it deals with Native American tribes in North America. It deals with the Maori in New Zealand. It deals with some of the indigenous in the Caribbean. It deals with indigenous in Australia. So Lamanite's sort of the catch-all term for indigenous people. It's not just, an American Indian, as Smith would have said in his day. And red is a term that I'm not sure when it starts to, come into the American lexicon, but definitely in the 19th century, if you see racial classifications from writers, not just in the United States, but the world in general, they do refer to some Native Americans as reds. And today we would never use that horribly offensive and racist language. Why Smith didn't use that, I don't know. But I can't think of any instances, and I could be wrong on this. I can't think of any instances where Smith used the word red in his private writings. He used the word Indian usually. And indigenous, of course, is more of a modern designation. So he definitely would have used indigenous. But he usually said Native American or Indian or Lamanite when he was referring to indigenous peoples. He never called them red. I don't know why that is. He certainly
Okay.
would have been able to read that if he chose to.
Okay, so that's interesting. So, see, we have this idea introduced early on about there's white and delightsome, and then there's the skin of darkness and all this kind of stuff. So we have this, these ideas are part of the story early on in the scriptures, and I guess the question I have for you is, like I'm wearing my Smith Rigdon 44 shirt, and a lot of people would like to point out that when Joseph Smith ran for president, he was relatively progressive for the time. He was wanting prison reform. He also wanted to free the slaves. And he kind of ran on an abolitionist ticket. Here you have this guy wearing a top hat from Illinois running on an abolitionist ticket, and who gets assassinated. No, I'm not talking about Abraham Lincoln. I'm talking about Joseph Smith. Maybe talk about how Joseph Smith politically what he was going on, because he was a product of his time, but he was also kind of ahead of his time as well.
Well, Smith was he was a he bought into this idea, or he taught this idea that it was very prevalent at the time towards indigenous populations, and that is that they had to be redeemed. And one of the things that Smith had taught for a very long time, and this kind of goes back to your Book of Mormon, and I'll comment on the politics in just a quick second, is that the Book of Mormon offers a blueprint to redeem these fallen people from their degenerate state. And Smith imbibes these well, let's be frank, imbibes these terribly racist views about Native peoples from the larger environment. And it goes something like this. All people were white at one point, and indigenous in particular did something wrong to merit God's disfavor. He cursed them with a skin of blackness, as the Book of Mormon said. They would have to overcome that curse through righteous living and baptism and all of that. And the Book of Mormon said that they would become white and delightsome, which is the color of heaven, right? That God would make everybody white. It's the color of purity. Those are the racial tropes that are offensive to us today. But in those days, those were the prevailing racial tropes. So whiteness was a sign of purity, and the natives would have to be redeemed. And just one last thought on this. Black people will read this as they're investigating the church, and they're asking, this doesn't talk about, people of African descent. It's clearly talking about Lamanites, but we're also deemed to be cursed. How does this apply to us? And so Mormons were teaching in the 19th century a racial fluidity, that through righteous living, you could shed that curse and be white again to inherit God's presence. And I know this is really just tough stuff, but a lot of Protestant Christians were teaching this at the time because whiteness was the color of God, right? It was the color of purity. And Smith and the Latter-day Saints were caught up in these racialized tropes, and they were teaching this. And this teaching is no longer taught by the church today. It fell out of favor just after the Second World War, when, of course, the civil rights movement pops up and Black and brown people are frankly offended by this, to think that they have to aspire to whiteness in order to merit God's favor. So Smith, in that case, uh, he's not progressive at all. He's just kind of he's talking about the status quo, about how the world's race has to be redeemed from their fallen state. Smith has some other progressive ways. I don't know if I would characterize him an abolitionist. Smith was a colonizer. And what that means is that Smith, again, was endorsing a very common view of his time, one that was taught by Abraham Lincoln, one that was taught by Lincoln's mentor, Henry Clay, one that was taught by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. And what that was is that in the spring of 1844, just before Smith was murdered, he was teaching colonization that meant that the government would raise money, they would sell lands in the West and cobble together a package to buy the freedom of slaves and then colonize them to Africa. And what's interesting about Smith's views, again, they're not unique. I mean, this is a very prominent idea from the politicians that I mentioned. And the idea would be that Black and white people couldn't coexist. You can't just buy somebody's freedom and let them to hang around in the community. So there was sort of a segregationist ethos. You had to segregate these two. And of course, the second part of the equation is how damaging this was to, by this point, African Americans, people who had been here a generation or two. You're sending them to West Africa. They'd never been there before. And they do try this for a very short while, where some of Black people are emancipated through the colonization society. And they go to Liberia, which is one of the colonies that houses them, and the mortality rate is through the roof. Disease, starvation, poverty, all of that. So it's not a very good policy at all. But that's the impulse behind it, is that Black and white people can't coexist.
Yeah, that's thanks for pointing that out. And I also want to point out that actually one of the the founder of the Jehovah's Witnesses, Charles Taz Russell, some earlier teachings of that church also talked about becoming white, that Black people would become white in heaven as well. So this was something that existed in different groups, and they would be a restorationist type kind of movement as well. So these ideas were definitely in the ether, if you will, of that time.
Oh,
So I
good.
guess.
I didn't know that, Steve. Thanks for that.
Yeah, it's really interesting stuff.
Yeah.
And so I actually, of course, I would love to stay in the 19th century because that's, like I said, my wheelhouse, but I want to get us into the 20th century now. And actually, before we do that, let's start with this. Um, Elijah Abel is often viewed as somebody who was given the priesthood, and he's touted as that person. But what would later happen to Elijah Abel's priesthood with
Boy,
Joseph
that's
Smith?
a subject of controversy. The reason why it's controversial in the church or among the leadership, it's controversial for two reasons. Number one, later church leaders create this narrative that the priesthood and temple ban began with Joseph Smith. Now, my book talks about this in great length, but there's no founding revelation to which they can turn to say, hey, the prophet Joseph Smith started the ban. There's nothing there. And they scour the church records looking for a particular revelation that Joseph Smith started the ban, and they couldn't find it. And so later on, even after Elijah Abel died, they claimed that it was a mistake that he was ordained. Now, they don't have any evidence that it was a mistake, but that's the position they take, because they want to believe that Joseph Smith is the originator of the ban, because Joseph Smith was, of course, the founding prophet who created the most significant doctrines for the Restoration movement. And so there's that. They try to, it's just a mistake. And then the second thing is that the church in Salt Lake, I might add, will learn about Elijah Abel's priesthood ordination for the first time in 1922, when an assistant church historian named Andrew Jensen publishes a 4-volume Latter-day Saint biography. You can find it online. I think it's online. And he mentions it's a encyclopedia sort of thing, and you could look up Abel by his name in the alphabet, and he's got a little section on Elijah Abel, and it says that he's a priesthood holder. This is the first time that Latter-day Saints are learning about this when they read this book in the 1920s. And they're writing into the church leaders, and they're saying, wait a minute, this guy holds the priesthood? I thought that Black people were banned. And the leaders are flummoxed because they're angry actually at Andrew Jensen for opening up this can of worms. And they write back to the saints. When I say they, I'm talking about the church president, David O. McKay. I'm talking about J. Reuben Clark, his counselor. I'm talking about the church historian and senior apostle, Joseph Fielding Smith. There's a whole bunch of them that write back, and they give different answers. They'll say stuff like, Elijah Abel was ordained and it was a mistake. Now, they have no evidence for this, but this is just what they're saying because it doesn't really square with what they think about the ban. And one of them writes, Joseph Fielding Smith says that there were actually two Elijah Abels on Nauvoo, one black and one white. I mean, I had no evidence for any of this. And then J. Reuben Clark wrote somebody, and he said, yeah, it wasn't just Abel. We've got a couple of other colored brethren, too, that held the priesthood. So now he's opening up this door even more, acknowledging that there were people in the early church who were ordained. And of course, it's really hard to say that it's an exception, Steve, if you've got multiple people being ordained under Smith's tutelage. So that does change in 1852. And I think this is important to note. It changes. Brigham Young seemed to be okay with Black men holding the priesthood until they started taking white polygamous wives. And when he found out that a couple of Black priesthood holders were taking white polygamous wives, that's when the whole thing went south.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thanks for bringing that up. And again, we'll talk a little bit about the one drop rule in a little bit, but I wanted to, since we're in the 20th century now, I wanted to talk about Joseph Fielding Smith's book, The Way to Perfection, and the impact that had on this whole conversation as well. That came out in
Yeah,
1931, right? I believe so.
1931. Yeah, good memory. So Joseph Fielding Smith was born in the Salt Lake Territory, the Utah Territory, as it was called, in 1876. And he's the grandnephew of the prophet Joseph Smith. His grandfather is Joseph Smith's brother and close confidant, Hiram Smith, who was murdered in Carthage jail in Illinois in 1844. So Hiram was there with Joseph. And so he's got royal Smith blood in him. And Joseph Fielding Smith was called by his father, Joseph F. Smith, the son of Hiram Smith. If you can keep all these Josephs straight. Joseph F. Smith, the son of Hiram Smith, called Joseph Fielding Smith into the apostleship in 1910. And Joseph, he was in his early 30s. So Joseph Fielding Smith would serve as an LDS apostle for over 6 decades. And then the last year and a half of his life, he was the LDS church president, and he died in the early 70s. And he was looked upon as being the church's best theologian. He's creating theology. It's not a whole lot that he's creating stuff, is that he's systematizing it, and he's writing it in such a way where it's digestible for the body of the saints. And his first book on race, it's not his first book, but it's his first book on race, was published in 1931. And as a historian, I always have to contextualize stuff. And when it was published in 1931, Black men were being lynched routinely. Eugenics laws were legal. The country was segregated badly. Protestant ministers were members of the Ku Klux Klan. And so it was a terrible time in this country's history dealing with race. And sad to say that Smith's book bore some of these influences. And there was 2 chapters in particular that Latter-day Saints would look at. And chapters 15 and 16 talked about the curse of Cain, that Black people were less valiant in the premortal existence. But it went even further than your typical doctrinal rationale for the ban. It said that Black people would only be fit to be servants to white people in the next life. And in Smith's case, Joseph Fielding's case, he's quoting from Brigham Young, who also said that. And in Brigham Young's case, he's just simply quoting from Genesis, where there's a curse on Ham, and his son and his posterity would be cursed. And the other sons who were not cursed would hold a position of power over their sons who were cursed. And so that's the rationale for slavery, also, I might add. So anyway, Smith is picking this up, and he writes this in his book. He also says that Negroes are inferior to white people. I mean, he spells it right out. And in 1931, this is not controversial, sad to say. It's more normal than we would ever like to imagine. But as this book gets reprinted and reprinted and reprinted from 1931 all the way to 1989, when it was finally taken out of print, it is no longer fashionable to teach that Black people are inferior to white people or that they would be servants. And so, in the next slide. So, a lot of Latter-day Saints and media, journalists will pick up on this best-selling Mormon book, and they'll write about the racism. And it really puts the church and Smith on the defense, because it's such a horribly racist book. And why it wasn't taken out of print long before 1989 is, boy, your guess is as good as mine. But it really caused the church a lot of fits. Let me say one last thing about this book. It was so influential in the church that the church leaders of the 1930s used that book as the basis for adult and youth Sunday school classes. They would structure lessons around this book, including race. And some of the questions that the Sunday school participants were asked to answer were, I'll just quote from one, discuss page 106 in Smith's book that says that Black people are an inferior race. This is what they're asked to talk about in Sunday school in the 1930s and 40s. And by the 1960s, the leaders recognized that this book is really offensive. And when they translate it into Portuguese, because they're now missionizing in Brazil, that when they translate it into Portuguese, they remove chapters 15 and 16, which talks about the curse and the inferiority of Black people and all of that. They just take it right out because they know it's going to be controversial for prospective converts.
Also touch on too, he actually embraces the idea of British Israelism, which talks about like Europeans and stuff being descendant, like, of the 10 lost tribes, that kind of stuff. And so it kind of puts Black people at this level, and then it elevates white people to even like a higher status with this theory. Now, what I find so fascinating is during this time, that was a real popular theory in the 19th century of British Israelism. But right around the same time, there's this guy named Herbert W. Armstrong who would found the Worldwide Church of God, or at the time would be the Radial Church of God, and then become the Worldwide Church of God. And he adopted the British Israelism stuff as well. And as a result, they wouldn't allow interracial dating or marrying in that church for the history of that church as well. So here you have a parallel organization kind of following very similar practices and everything like that, which I just find so interesting to see that there's other groups that are picking this stuff up as well. It kind of speaks to that time, doesn't it?
Yeah, this is not, I mean, you're pointing out great examples. You mentioned Charles Taze Russell a minute ago, and now this example. I mean, Latter-day Saints in so many ways are not unique. They're influenced by the culture of the times, and British Israelism that we're talking about was a movement that began in the late 19th century in England, and it filters over to the United States. And if you look at this idea that the lost tribes flowed from Northern European countries, and of course those are white countries typically, and Latter-day Saints will pick up on that language, and they'll argue that the leaders of the church derive from a particular lineage called Ephraim, and the descendants of Ephraim flow from Northern Europe. And that's a nice way of saying white people will be governing the church. And so the Saints are picking up on this theology, and they're publishing all of this stuff in their journals and magazines, and they're inculcating it into their sermons up until about the Second World War. And you start to see this British Israelism language, fade away. But it's it's no secret that the Latter-day Saints in this view, it's paralleling the larger Christian world because Latter-day Saints are reading the stuff that's out there.
So what I find so fascinating is when we are talking about the role the church is playing, and we have this one drop rule, and maybe just explain what was the one drop rule. Just explain that to the audience real quick before we move
Yeah, the
on.
one drop rule meant that if you had 100 ancestors in your family tree and one of them derived from sub-Saharan Africa, that meant that you were Black. Now, I just want to be clear what that means. 1 out of 100. So you could have 99 of your relatives in your ancestral tree not from sub-Saharan Africa, but if one is, you're considered Black. This is not based on skin color. It's based on lineage. That's really, really critical. So it's kind of hard for some people to think that the church followed the one drop rule when it came to priesthood exclusion. And if it was determined that you had an ancestor at any point in your family tree that derived from sub-Saharan Africa, that you'd be considered cursed or denied the priesthood. And you could have blonde hair and blue eyes. So it doesn't matter your skin color. You can go to Fiji, and the church did not think or believe that Fijians derived from sub-Saharan Africa. And Fijians have dark skin. So in Fiji, with dark skin, you could have the priesthood and go to the temple. But yet, if you were somebody else with blue eyes and blonde hair and all of that, fair skin, you could be denied the priesthood if you had an ancestor way back when from sub-Saharan Africa. So it's not based on skin color, it's based on lineage.
And so that leads to this period of time where you have the church expanding, and you've got what's so interesting is you have two different societies. You have South Africa with the Afrikaner population, basically the apartheid era, where there was a deeply racist society, segregated apartheid, and then we also have the South during this period of time that also practices segregation. And what was so interesting is that both these groups, because there was, even though that you would have these racist people that would, but the problem is a lot of these people also didn't pass the one drop rule test as a result. So maybe speak to that, because that's what's so ironic, is that these societies that would easily maybe embrace the book, some of these doctrines, in some cases would be excluded from being the priesthood as well.
Yeah, I want to say just one more context of the one drop rule
Sure.
is that it's a complete fiction. Race is a construct, and there's a number of problems with the one drop rule. Number one is, how do you know who's got one drop? I mean, it's just crazy to think. It was created during the 1830s on southern slave plantations. It was a way to designate Black and white people to keep them apart. They were afraid of interracial intimacy. And so if you were designated with one drop, that meant that you just couldn't get close to that person, whether they were slave or free. And the United States Census would adopt the one drop rule in 1930. So it's not fringe. And if you had one drop of African ancestry, you were considered a Negro. If you look at the census, that's what it uses. They use the word Negro. Um, and so the states at the time, after the American Civil War, they're worried about interracial marriage and all of that. And so they create a new way to define race. Some of them adopt the one drop rule and some of them don't. And instead, they come up with fractions. Like if you live in Georgia in 1905 and you were 1/4, they would define a Negro as somebody who's 1/4 African. Now that just simply means that of your four grandparents, one of them would have to derive from Africa. That's what it means. And then or another state over, North Carolina, let's say, they might say 1/8, or South Carolina might say 1/32. I mean, these are just fractions created by lawmakers sitting around a table in their state capital, and they're defining race. And it has enormous significance, because if you define somebody by 1/8 or 1/32 or 1/4, you're denying them the right to go to good schools, the right to go to a restaurant of your choice, the right to go to the zoo, right? They're using it as a way to justify racial oppression. And so the saints the Latter-day Saints follow the most draconian racial marker, which is the one drop rule. And when they go into South Africa and Brazil, those are the two countries that give them fits. is that they are instructed by their mission presidents, who are instructed by the apostles. They tell the missionaries, stay away from regions of South Africa and Brazil that are known to have majority Black populations. So like in Brazil, for example, the northern part of the country is majority Black. The southern part is inhabited by, around the Second World War, it's mostly inhabited by Germans. And so they tell them to go to the southern part of the state because German people, their ethnic origins are certain. They probably don't derive from sub-Saharan Africa. So we'll be safe in working with them. And they do the same thing in South Africa. And the issue is that there's a couple of issues with this. Number one, they can't tell who bears the curse, right? Who's got one drop. They just can't tell by looking at somebody. And if they did come across a home where it became clear from looking at somebody that they may be from sub-Saharan Africa, they would simply say, "Oh, we're in the wrong place. I'm so sorry." And they would just leave. There's a number of things they would say at the doorstep. And sometimes when they couldn't determine if somebody derived from Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, they would go in the house and they would ask about the family very discreetly, and I might add dishonestly. They would ask about the family because they're not interested about the family. They want to know where you're from. They want to know if you're cursed. And they would ask to see your photo album, and they would look for any clues to see that if you'd been to Africa or sub-Saharan Africa. And so in some places, Steve, that they tried to go into Cuba. And when they went into Cuba, or they tried to anyway, they wanted to find an area of Cuba that would be considered safe. That is, where white people lived. And they wanted to avoid the mixed race population and the Cubans of darker skin. And some of the church leaders were told by a Mormon sociologist named Lowry Nelson, they said, "This is stupid. You can't go into Cuba and just cherry pick who you bring the gospel to." And the other thing that really poses fits for the brethren, in addition to not be able to determine who bears the curse, is that there's a conflict with Mormon theology. And the ban puts the church leaders in conflict with its theology. And that is, the Mormon scriptures, including the Book of Mormon, it talks about taking the gospel to every kindred, nation, tongue, and people. Well, you can't do that if you can't go into sub-Saharan Africa, right? Because of this odious ban. And so they talk about this around the time of the Second World War. You could see in their church meetings, there's this mega conflict about the need to bring the gospel to the world. But on the other hand, they know they're running into issues, especially in South Africa and Brazil, because they know they're not dumb. They know they're baptizing and conferring priesthood ordination on people with one drop. They know it, and they talk about it. And sometimes they learn about it after the fact and ignore it. And sometimes if the brother has a priesthood calling and they find out that he's from sub-Saharan Africa, they release him from his calling in shame.
So we're getting pressed for time here, and it's, I love it when we get together and talk and have these conversations. And of course, they're going to go off, and that's fine. But I wanted to, I guess, because we're running short here, I want to kind of talk about the attempt, in I guess as in brief as you can. I know I want to be respectful of your time, but so this all leads up to an attempt to lift the ban by David O. McKay, and then ultimately the ban is lifted in 1978. So maybe just kind of give us an overview of that period of time, what made them decide the aborted attempt, and then finally what caused them to actually lift the ban.
In the 1960s, the church is under heavy assault from the civil rights movement, the NAACP, a Black civil rights organization. And there were dozens of universities by 1968, the late 60s. They were boycotting Brigham Young University athletic events. And the church was under heavy assault. The media was running unfavorable stories about the church. George Romney, a Mormon governor from Michigan, was a presidential candidate in 1968. So the church was taking just heavy criticism for the ban. And there was a first presidency counselor named Hugh B. Brown. He was the counselor to the church prophet, a guy named David O. McKay. And he thought that the best way to get the civil rights organizations off their back He thought that the best way to end the BYU race protests. Oh, I should tell you too that the federal government was investigating BYU for alleged violations of the Civil Rights Act of '64. So, in order to make this all go away, Brown said, "Let's ordain black men to the priesthood." And he led this covert attempt in the fall of 1969, without going into the details, led this covert attempt to do it. And by this time, President McKay was 95 years of age. He was really slowing down, and they convinced him. And when other members of the apostles learned about what Brown was doing to the president, sort of browbeating him to ordaining, black men, they put a stop to it, and Brown was crushed. And one of the people who initially supported Brown's attempt to get President McKay to lift the ban was Spencer W. Kimball, a senior apostle who would become the church president himself in December of 1973. And one of the biggest revelations of my book is that Spencer Kimball wanted to lift the ban the minute he became the church president. But Mormon revelation suggests that it's a process rather than an event. So Mormons use the term revelation a lot. And in Mormon scripture, it talks about it as a process. And what that means is, in order to lift the ban, you have to have consensus of the top 15 leaders. And it took Spencer Kimball 5 years to get that consensus, from the time he was ordained in 1973 to the time he finally lifted the ban in 1978. And once the ban was lifted, the church could truly be the global organization that so many, including Kimball, had envisioned it to be.
Wow. And then, of course, after him, we'd have Ezra Taft Benson, and there were some concerns about what would happen there. And we can talk about that's a great thing to talk about in your other book, Thunder from the Right. Second Class Saints is the name of the book, Black Mormons and the Struggle for Racial Equality, published by Oxford University Press. I wish we had another hour or two to talk today, but I want to thank you for taking your time to come on Mormon Book Reviews today. And I guess I wanted to ask you, is there any final words you'd like to share with the audience? Any final thoughts?
Yeah, I would just say that this is the American story. It's Mormons aren't unique in racism, not at all. And I think it's one of the things that was important to me in this book is to talk about how people change and how they see things in a new light. And I think President Kimball, the president who lifted the ban, is a great example. He held racial prejudices common to men of his generation. He was born in 1899. And but yet he recognized intuitively how the ban affected real people, particularly Black people. And you can see this in his diaries where he meets with Black people and they're pouring out their hearts. They want to be members of the church and hold the priesthood and go to the temple. And so that weighs and tugs at his heartstrings. And you see the church, the Latter-day Saint church, grappling with these deep-rooted and systemic racial issues. And in 2013, they issue a powerful statement in which they denounce all of these anti-Black teachings that they had been teaching for so long. And for me, that's such an amazing, indeed miraculous thing, because it shows that you're not always wedded to a theology that's harmful, that you can live and you can grow from it. And in this case, you can begin the process of healing when you finally owned up to a theology that was damaging for so many years.
Well, that was great. Thank you so much for taking your time today, Matt. You're a good friend. I hope you have a blast in Texas, or not Texas, in St. George next month at the Whitmer gathering. I wish I could be there myself. A lot of friends are there as well. Folks, I would like for you to leave comments and let us know what you thought about this interview. We really think it's important to have these important conversations. This is not a channel where we bash the church or go after it. We just really want, I tell people, as Latter-day Saints, it's your birthright to know the history of your church. And I think that's one of the most important things we've been able to do here at Mormon Book Reviews is talk about your history and do it in a neutral way and in a way that we're not trying to weaponize it or anything like that. We're just trying to describe these facts. And I think you do that beautifully in your book, Second Class Saints. So we're going to have links in the description to both the books that we talked about with Matt today as well. For those of you who would like to financially support the channel at MormonBookReviews.com, where we have a merch store. Also, for those of you who'd like to financially support us, we have links to Venmo, PayPal, and Patreon. And I want to thank all those of you who do financially support the channel. Couldn't do it without you. And remember, the most important thing is this: all the voices of the restoration will be heard here on Mormon Book Reviews.